He mocked her dream journal until he saw himself in it. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the small cottage as Ilara stood in the doorway, clutching the brass key her grandmother had left her. 3 months had passed since the funeral, but stepping into this place still felt like trespassing on sacred ground. The familiar scent of lavender and old books wrapped around her like a bittersweet embrace, bringing tears she thought she'd already cried. "You finally made it," came a voice from behind her. Ilara turned to see Marcus, her childhood friend and now the town's landscape architect, approaching with his usual confident stride. His designer boots crunched on the gravel driveway as he surveyed the property with professional eyes. "I was wondering when you'd show up to deal with this mess." Ilara's jaw tightened. "It's not a mess, Marcus. It was her home. Come on, Ilara. Look at it objectively." "Bo!" He gestured toward the overgrown garden that sprawled beyond the cottage's wraparound porch. "Your grandmother was a sweet woman, but this place has been neglected for years. The property value is tanking because of that jungle out there. You could sell this land for a fortune if you just cleared it all out and let me design something modern." The garden did look wild, almost chaotic. Vines had claimed the old wooden fence. Flowers bloomed in seemingly random patches, and herbs had spread far beyond their original borders. To most people, it probably did look like neglect, but Ilara remembered her grandmother's hands in that soil, remembered the way she would pause and listen to something only she could hear. "She always said the flowers had their own language," Ilara murmured, more to herself than to Marcus. Marcus laughed. Not unkindly, but with the dismissive tone he'd perfected over the years. "Your grandmother was getting old, Ilara. Sometimes elderly people, well, they start believing in things that aren't really there. Speaking of which, I found this in my truck." He pulled out a worn leather journal from his jacket pocket. "You left it there after the funeral. Some kind of dream diary." Heat flooded Ilara's cheeks as she snatched the journal from his hands. She'd forgotten she'd had it with her that day, forgotten she'd even brought it to the funeral. The journal contained 3 years of her most private thoughts, dreams, and yes, embarrassingly detailed descriptions of dreams that featured Marcus himself. "It's nothing important," she said quickly, clutching it to her chest. "Right." His smirk suggested he'd already glimpsed some of its contents. "Look, I know you're grieving, but don't let sentiment cloud your judgment here. This property could be your fresh start. You could move back to the city, get that marketing job you always talked about. Stop chasing those artistic dreams of yours." The way he said artistic dreams made them sound foolish, childish. Ilara had been a freelance graphic designer for 5 years now, building a modest but growing client base. But Marcus had always seen her work as a hobby rather than a career. Just like he'd always seen her grandmother's garden as chaos rather than intention. "I'm not making any decisions today," she said firmly. "I need time to go through her things, to understand what she left me." Marcus shrugged, pulling out his phone to check messages. "Suit yourself, but don't take too long. The real estate market won't wait forever." He paused at his truck door. "And Ilara, maybe it's time to stop living in fantasy land. Your grandmother's gone, and no amount of wishing is going to bring her back or make that garden mean something it doesn't." As his truck disappeared down the country road, Ilara stood alone on the porch, the journal pressed against her heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and for just a moment she could swear she heard her grandmother's voice on the wind. "The flowers listen, dear one. They always listen." She opened the journal to a random page, her own handwriting staring back at her. "Dreamed of Marcus again. We were standing in a garden full of yellow roses, and he was telling me he finally understood." She slammed the journal shut, her face burning with embarrassment and something else she couldn't quite name. Walking to the edge of the garden, Ilara knelt beside a patch of small blue flowers she remembered from childhood. "Forget-me-nots," her grandmother had called them. As she touched their delicate petals, she noticed something that made her breath catch. They weren't scattered randomly as they appeared from a distance. They formed a perfect circle around an old yellow rosebush, and the rosebush itself seemed to point toward a winding path lined with rosemary. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Each flower has its own story, Elara. You just have to learn how to read it. Chapter 2. The next morning brought a soft rain that turned the earth fragrant and dark. Elara had spent a sleepless night in her grandmother's bed, the journal beside her on the nightstand, unopened but impossible to ignore. She dreamed fitfully of yellow roses and blue forget-me-nots, of her grandmother's weathered hands pointing towards something just beyond her vision. Now, standing in the cottage's small kitchen, with a cup of tea warming her hands, she watched the rain create patterns on the window. The garden looked different in the grey morning light, less chaotic, more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The circle of forget-me-nots was clearer now, and she could see other patterns emerging. Clusters of herbs that seemed to follow invisible pathways, flowering vines that created natural boundaries between different sections. The sound of a truck in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Marcus getting out, a stack of papers in his hand, and determination in his stride. She considered not answering the door, but he was already knocking. "I brought the preliminary plans," he announced as she opened the door, pushing past her into the small living room. His hair was damp from the rain, and he smelled like expensive cologne and ambition. "I worked on them all night. Wait until you see what this place could become." He spread the architectural drawings across her grandmother's antique dining table, his excitement palpable. The plans showed a modern minimalist landscape, geometric lawns, strategically placed contemporary sculptures, a few ornamental trees arranged with mathematical precision. It was beautiful in its way, clean and sophisticated, but it bore no resemblance to the wild garden outside. "You'd have the most sought-after property in the county," Marcus continued, his finger tracing the planned pathways. "Clean lines, low maintenance, perfect for entertaining. We could have this installed within 6 weeks." Elara stared at the plans, trying to imagine her grandmother's reaction to such sterile perfection. "What about the existing plants?" "All removed, obviously. Most of them are weeds anyway, or past their prime. We'd start fresh with hardy, drought-resistant varieties that actually make sense for the climate." He looked up from the drawings, his brown eyes bright with enthusiasm. "This could be featured in Architectural Digest, Elara. Your property could be famous." The word famous hung in the air between them, and Elara realized that Marcus's vision had more to do with his portfolio than her happiness. She thought of her journal upstairs, of the dreams where Marcus had looked at her with recognition and understanding, rather than the polite condescension he showed her now. "I need more time," she said quietly. His expression shifted, irritation replacing enthusiasm. "Time for what? To pretend that overgrown mess has some deeper meaning? Elara, you're being ridiculous. Your grandmother was a lovely woman, but she wasn't some mystical garden whisperer. She was an elderly lady who let her yard get out of control. You didn't know her like I did. I knew her well enough. She was kind, she baked good cookies, and she believed in fairy tales." Marcus's voice took on the patient tone he might use with a stubborn child. "Look, I found something else in my truck this morning." He pulled out her journal again, and Elara's heart sank. "I couldn't help but flip through it a bit. Some interesting reading in here." The humiliation was immediate and crushing. Her private thoughts, her vulnerable dreams about him, exposed and dismissed. She could see the smug satisfaction in his expression, the way he held the journal like evidence of her foolishness. "Give that back." Her voice was barely a whisper. "In a minute. I want to read you something first." He opened to a page he'd clearly marked. "I dreamed Marcus and I were dancing in a garden where every flower meant something different. He told me he'd finally learned to listen, really listen, not just to words, but to the silence between them." Pretty poetic stuff, Elara. Very creative. The way he said creative made it sound like a disease. Elara felt something shift inside her, anger rising to replace the shame. "Those are my private thoughts." "Private thoughts about me, apparently. Look, I'm flattered, really, but maybe it's time to separate fantasy from reality." I'm trying to help you make a smart business decision here, not fulfill some romantic dream you scribbled in a diary. He tossed the journal onto the table next to his architectural plans, the contrast stark and symbolic. Modern ambition versus romantic dreams, success versus sentiment, his vision versus her grandmother's legacy. I want you to leave, Ilara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. Ilara, don't be dramatic. I'm offering you a chance to transform your life. You're offering me a chance to erase everything that matters to me. There's a difference. She picked up her journal, holding it against her chest like armor. And for your information, my grandmother wasn't losing her mind. She was one of the wisest people I've ever known. Wise enough to let valuable property go to waste. Wise enough to create something that mattered more than money. Ilara moved to the front door, opening it deliberately. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was beginning to filter through the clouds. I'd like you to leave now. Marcus gathered his plans with sharp, irritated movements. Fine, but don't come crying to me when you realize you've thrown away the opportunity of a lifetime for a bunch of weeds and childhood fantasies. He paused in the doorway, his expression softening slightly. I'm trying to be your friend here, Ilara. Don't let grief make you stupid. After he left, Ilara stood in the silence of her grandmother's house, the journal trembling in her hands. She walked to the window overlooking the garden, studying the patterns that had caught her attention the day before. The forget-me-nots, the yellow roses, the rosemary path, they seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond her understanding. Opening the journal to the page Marcus had read aloud, she reread her own words about learning to listen to the silence between words. Then she looked up at the garden again, and for the first time she began to truly see it not as chaos, but as language waiting to be translated. Chapter 3. The local library in town was small but well organized, its botanical section tucked between cookbooks and local history. Ilara spent hours there that afternoon, pulling every book about flower meanings and garden symbolism she could find. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, had been helpful, even producing some rare volumes from the archives when she learned about Ilara's quest. Your grandmother was a regular here, Mrs. Chen had mentioned as she unlocked a glass case, always checking out books about herbs and flowers. She had quite an extensive knowledge of what she called the old language. Now, back at the cottage as evening approached, Ilara sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by open books and hastily scribbled notes. The journal lay beside her, its pages finally serving as a bridge between her dreams and reality, rather than a source of embarrassment. According to the Victorian language of flowers, forget-me-nots meant true love and remembrance. Yellow roses symbolized friendship and joy, but also farewell. Rosemary was for remembrance and fidelity. Each flower in her grandmother's garden seemed to whisper a different word in an ancient conversation. With a notebook in hand, Ilara ventured outside as the sun began to set, painting the garden in golden light. She followed the path of rosemary, noting how it led from the forget-me-not circle to a section filled with lavender and white roses, peace and new beginnings. Beyond that, a patch of red poppies clustered near an old wooden bench where she and her grandmother used to sit for their evening talks. According to her research, red poppies meant consolation in death, comfort in loss. Her hands shook as she wrote down each discovery. This wasn't random. This was intentional, planned, cultivated, with the patience of someone who knew she wouldn't be there to explain it herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Had dinner with the Hendersons. They're interested in buying your property sight unseen if you're willing to negotiate. This could solve all your problems, Ilara. Call me. She almost deleted the message without responding, but something made her hesitate. Instead, she opened her journal and flipped to one of the dreams she'd written about him months ago. We were in a library together, and Marcus was reading aloud from an old book about plant meanings. When he got to the part about sunflowers meaning adoration and loyalty, he looked up at me and said, "I never knew flowers could be so honest." Then we walked outside, and there was a garden where every plant seemed to be having a conversation with every other plant. And Marcus said, "How did I never hear this before?" The sunflowers. Ilara looked up from the journal, scanning the garden in the fading light. There, tall and golden against the cottage's east wall, a row of sunflowers faced not the setting sun, but the window of what had been her childhood bedroom. According to her grandmother's botanical code, they meant adoration, loyalty, and looking toward the light, even in darkness. The pieces were falling into place, but there was something missing, some final element that would make the garden's message complete. As she walked the pathways her grandmother had created, Ilara felt like she was reading a story with the last chapter torn away. That night, she dreamed she was standing in the garden with her grandmother, who was young again, her hands strong and sure as she pointed to different flowers. "Each one is a word, dear one," her grandmother said in the dream. "But the whole garden, that's the sentence." "What is it saying?" Dream Ilara asked. "That love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. It becomes the careful tending of hope, the patient cultivation of joy, the deliberate planting of comfort where it will be needed most." Ilara woke with tears on her cheeks and absolute clarity in her heart. She understood now what her grandmother had been trying to tell her, but more than that, she understood what she needed to do next. The next morning brought Marcus to her door again, but this time he wasn't alone. A well-dressed couple in their 50s stood beside him, looking at the cottage with the calculating eyes of investors. "Ilara, I'd like you to meet the Hendersons," Marcus said, his smile sharp with anticipated commission. "They're very interested in your property." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, extending a manicured hand. "We absolutely love the location, dear. So private and charming. Of course, we'd want to completely renovate, tear down this old cottage and build something more contemporary. And that garden," she gestured vaguely toward the riot of flowers. "Well, that would all have to go, naturally." Mr. Henderson nodded enthusiastically. "We're thinking infinity pool, outdoor kitchen, maybe a tennis court. Really maximize the potential of the space." Ilara felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "I'm not selling." The words surprised everyone, including herself. Marcus's smile faltered. "Now, Ilara, let's not be hasty. The Hendersons are prepared to make a very generous offer. Cash, no contingencies." "I said I'm not selling." Her voice was stronger now, certain. "This garden isn't going anywhere." Mrs. Henderson's expression tightened. "Dear, I understand sentimental attachment, but surely you can see that the practical thing, Ilara interrupted, would be for you to find another property. This one isn't available." After they left, Marcus lingered, his frustration barely contained. "What's gotten into you? Yesterday you were unsure, now you're acting like this place is some kind of shrine." "Maybe it is," Ilara said, surprising herself again with her directness. "Maybe some things matter more than money." "Like what? A bunch of old flowers, your dream journal?" His voice took on the mocking tone she was beginning to hate. "Come on, Ilara, you can't live in a fantasy forever." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw someone who had never learned to listen to anything that couldn't speak in dollars and profit margins. In her journal, she dreamed of him understanding, of him hearing the language of growing things and quiet wisdom. But dreams, she was learning, were sometimes just wishes for people to become who they weren't. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I can't live in a fantasy forever, but I can live in a garden that my grandmother spent years teaching to speak. I can learn a language that doesn't have anything to do with property values or architectural fame." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Ilara. A big one." After he left, Ilara walked back to the garden, to the sunflowers that faced her bedroom window. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote, "Some dreams aren't about the future. Some dreams are about learning to see what's already there." Chapter 4. 6 months later, the garden had become Ilara's teacher, translator, and closest confidant. She'd spent the winter months researching, planning, and slowly beginning to understand the intricate conversations her grandmother had planted in soil and seasons. Each day brought new discoveries, the way the herb garden spelled out recipes for healing teas, how the placement of certain flowers created natural pest control, the deliberate timing of blooms to ensure color and fragrance throughout the growing season. Spring had transformed the cottage grounds into something extraordinary, not the wild chaos Marcus had dismissed, but a living tapestry where every element served multiple purposes. Ilara had learned to read the garden's moods, to understand which plants thrived in companionship and which preferred solitude, to see the careful architecture hidden in what appeared to be natural randomness. Her freelance design business had evolved too. Working from the cottage, she'd developed a specialty in botanical illustration and garden-themed branding, her client base growing through word of mouth and social media posts that showcased her grandmother's garden in different seasons and lights. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus had been right about one thing. The property had become famous, featured not in Architectural Digest, but in gardening magazines and blogs that celebrated sustainable, meaningful landscape design. On a warm April morning, Ilara was sketching near the Rosemary Path when she heard the familiar sound of Marcus's truck in the driveway. She hadn't seen him since their confrontation 6 months ago, though she'd heard through town gossip that his landscape architecture firm was struggling after a few high-profile projects fell through. He approached slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like humility. His designer boots were scuffed now, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Hello, Ilara." She looked up from her sketchbook, studying his face. "Marcus, what brings you by?" He gestured vaguely at the garden around them, his expression conflicted. "I wanted to see what you'd done with the place. I heard it was getting some attention." The garden was indeed remarkable in spring. The forget-me-nots had multiplied, creating rivers of blue that flowed between islands of herbs and flowering shrubs. The yellow roses were heavy with buds, and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and honeysuckle. But more than its beauty, the space radiated an almost palpable sense of purpose, of conversations carried on in the language of growth and seasonal change. "It's beautiful," Marcus admitted, his voice quiet. "I mean, really beautiful. Not like anything I would have designed, but—" He trailed off, looking around with what seemed like genuine wonder. "How did you know what to do?" "I learned to listen," Ilara said simply. "The way my grandmother always said I should." Marcus nodded slowly, then pulled something from his jacket pocket. Ilara's journal, the same one he'd mocked and dismissed months ago. "I've been carrying this around," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I don't know why. Maybe because I kept thinking about some of the things you wrote." Ilara took the journal, surprised by its return, such as the dreams about gardens having conversations, about learning to hear silence between words. He looked up at her then, and his expression was different, less certain, more open. "I had a dream about that recently, about standing in a place where everything was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand the language." For the first time in their friendship, Marcus looked vulnerable, uncertain. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be questioning everything he thought he knew. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, "about some things mattering more than money. My business has been falling apart, partly because I stopped listening to what clients actually wanted. I got so focused on making each project look like my vision that I forgot gardens are supposed to be for the people who live in them." Ilara closed the journal, considering her words carefully. "What made you change your mind?" "Honestly, I drove by here a few weeks ago and saw you working in the garden. You looked—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You looked like you belonged somewhere, like you'd found your place in the world. I realized I'd never felt that way about anything I'd built." A butterfly landed on the rosemary beside them, its wings catching the morning light. Marcus watched it with an expression of quiet amazement, as if he'd never really noticed butterflies before. "Would you—" He hesitated, then continued. "Would you be willing to teach me? About this kind of gardening, I mean. About listening to what plants actually need instead of just imposing my ideas on them. Elara looked at him for a long moment, remembering the dreams she'd written in her journal, the hopes she'd had that he might someday understand the language her grandmother had tried to teach her. Those dreams seemed naive now, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps the real Marcus, uncertain, questioning, willing to admit he might have been wrong, was more interesting than the confident fantasy version she'd imagined. I might be willing to share what I've learned, she said carefully, but it's not a quick process. Learning to listen takes time. I have time, Marcus said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. I'm not going anywhere. As if to punctuate his words, a breeze stirred through the garden, carrying the scent of lavender and the sound of bees among the flowering herbs. Elara opened her journal to a fresh page, thinking of her grandmother's words about love-changing form, becoming the patient cultivation of hope and the deliberate planting of comfort where it would be needed most. "All right," she said, looking up at Marcus, and then out at the garden that had taught her so much about the difference between dreams and reality, between what we imagine people might become and who they actually are. Let's start with the forget-me-nots. They have a lot to say about remembering what matters. As they walked deeper into the garden together, Elara realized her grandmother's final gift hadn't just been the house, or the flowers, or even the coded messages of love and remembrance. It had been the patience to wait for understanding, to bloom in its own season, the wisdom to plant seeds of hope even when you couldn't be certain they would grow, and the faith that sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, even the most unlikely conversations can find their way to flourish.